This afternoon, we'll try to be efficient because I'm sure you guys all want to kind of get on, begin your studying, get ready for Christmas, whatever else. So let's be efficient here. First thing I want to do is I want to go over homework number 5. I should have all texted that to you literally minutes ago because I just barely squeezed in here before 12:30. So you should all get your homework that shows up here in your email box. So let's go over this and talk about these one by one. Okay, here we go. So question number 1, this was the 3-period budget constraint. So basically you have to take the budget constraint for each of the 3 periods, you plug B1 into B2, the equation for B2 into equation B3, and then you remember that in B4 it has to equal 0, right? So you basically have 3 equations, the equation for B1, the equation for B2, and the equation for B3, and you can solve them, and what you should get is this, which essentially says that the present value of future revenue should equal the present value of future spending, okay? So this is just like what we had before, except we have this extra term in here, right? This term right here is extra, and that's from the 3rd period. So if you did this for the 4th period, you'd have this same equation, but with an extra term in here that includes the present value and the difference between the present value of revenue and the present value of expenses or spending. So if you generalize this in the 2nd equation, what do you get? Well, you get this, right? Generalized out. Once again, this is the present value of the difference between future revenue and future spending, and then 1 plus B1 is essentially what you borrow in the 1st period. So once again, this is just all saying that the present value of spending must equal the present value of revenue. How long is T here? T depends upon debt tolerance, right? In other words, how many periods can you spread out your ability to pay? That depends upon how much confidence markets have in you. And so if markets have more confidence, they're going to have more debt tolerance, and more debt tolerance probably means that you have a bigger T, meaning you can spread that out over more years. And debt tolerance, as we talked about in class, relates to institutions, it relates to your history, it relates to your political stability, it relates to your economic stability, all of those things. Deficits are countercyclical in the US. In order to deal with our budget problems, some have proposed a balanced budget amendment, meaning that all government spending would have to be paid for. So using our short-run model, what impact would this have on our aggregate demand model and our ISMP model? So what would this look like without actually doing any equations? I think the intuition of this is hopefully pretty straightforward, or I was hoping it'd be straightforward. Okay, oops, sorry, I'm not plugged in. Okay, so here we have our IS model. Okay, what's this going to look like now? Well, now for any economic shock, the government's going to have to keep the budget balanced. In other words, if there's a shock and the economy slows down and tax revenue begins to fall, the government's also going to have to cut government spending. So government spending is no longer exogenous in this model. It is endogenous, and it's going to vary with short-run output. So what's that going to mean? That means for any shock, we're going to have a bigger change in short-run output. So our IS curve is going to be flatter than it was before, because now if there's a shock, say for instance, some change in monetary policy, right? Now we're going to have a bigger change in short-run output than we would have had if we did not have to worry about the balanced budget amendment, right? So in other words, we know that countercyclical budget deficits are a stabilizer. They make the IS curve steeper. If you get rid of that stabilizer, the IS curve is going to get flatter. Same thing happens for aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Right? If our aggregate demand curve looked like this before, our aggregate demand curve under the balanced budget is going to be flatter. And so any shift or any shock is going to cause a bigger change in short-run output than it did before. And so this is why economists are not very big fans of balanced budget amendments. So, you know, for instance, you actually see this debate going on right now. The federal government does not have to operate under a balanced budget, but many states have balanced budget amendments, including Iowa has a balanced budget amendment. And so what's the problem is that during a recession like this one, Iowa is actually forced to cut spending and to possibly raise taxes during a crisis to keep the budget balanced. So, you know, many states are asking for bailouts as a result of the COVID crisis, and there's a lot of reasons why the federal government might want to bail them out. But, you know, one of the dumb reasons is that many states have balanced budgets and the federal government doesn't, right? And so if states were allowed to borrow during crises, many states would be in better shape. So economists are not big fans of balanced budget amendments for just this reason, right? Is that it makes fiscal policy less of a stabilizer, and it tends to magnify changes in short-run output. Okay, here's our question related to output per worker. So let's figure out comparative advantage here. I'm going to work through this because a couple of us did have some problems with this one. So really what you want to do is for each country, you want to figure out what the opportunity cost is. So we want to figure out the opportunity cost of Korean food and Korean electronics. What's the opportunity cost of Burmese food? And what's the opportunity cost of Burmese electronics? So what's the opportunity cost of Korean food? It's what you give up relative to what you get. For Korea, they give up 4/7 of an electronics. What's the opportunity cost of electronics? 7/4. What about for Burma? They give up 2 units of electronics for every 5 units of food, or 2/5 of electronics. And what about for electronics? 5/2 food. So who has comparative advantage in food? Well, who's the low opportunity cost producer? Burma is a low opportunity cost producer. Who has comparative advantage in electronics? Korea, because 7/4 is less than 5/2. So Korea should produce electronics, Burma should produce food. What price was it electronics? Can't remember my question here. What price would food sell for? Right, what price would food sell for? It has to sell between these, it has to sell between these 2 opportunity costs, right? So it has to sell between 2/5 a unit of electronics and 4/7 a unit of electronics, because that would be mutually beneficial for each country. All right, so the price has to be between these 2 opportunity costs. How much would a worker in how much would a worker in Burma be willing to pay to migrate to Korea? Well, you'll notice here from the question, a worker in Burma, once they move to Korea becomes 2 units more productive in food and 2 units more productive in electronics. So they would be willing to pay up to that amount to move. And so this is actually one of the things that has been suggested by economists. I don't quite know whether I believe this, because there's a lot of moral and other consequences of this, but many economists say, listen, why don't we charge a migration fee? You can come here to the US, but you have to pay. And how much you have to pay? Well, that depends upon what your industry is and how much more money you'll make when you're here. And so you can understand the economic logic of it. I don't know if, you know, if selling citizenship and all that is, you know, from an ethical perspective is the best thing, but it is an interesting idea. Think back to our Romer model. One thing that the Romer model developed did not include the impact of international trade. And so how might you modify the Romer model to incorporate the impact of international trade? You know, honestly, as long as you tried on this, I pretty much gave you full credit, you know, because, I mean, I'm asking you to be a little bit creative here, right? I'm asking you to be a little bit creative. So, and, you know, a couple of you actually did have, I would say, some pretty creative answers. This is just one answer I had off the top of my head. Is one way you could do this, and a couple of you had somewhat similar ideas, is you could take the Romer model and you could add an export sector to it. So you could say output was just like it was before, right? So output is a function of A times LYT, but then also some of our output is going to be devoted to exports. Okay, so some of our output we're going to devote domestically, and some of our output and some of our workers we're going to devote to working in the export sector. Okay, and then what could you do? You could think about a model in which, what are your ideas next period? They're related to ideas this period plus Z, that exogenous factor, plus L, plus N. This is all the same as before. But then we could have an additional factor. You could add this or multiply this, depending. That says that the amount of people that working in the export sector also has an impact, where T bar here is the impact of trade on ideas. That's probably not the most clever way, or the most, the most insightful way of doing this, but you could do something like this. In this model, notice what's going to happen. Now there's a trade-off. What happens if you devote more people to producing net exports? Well, it's going to leave less for you to consume, right? Because consumption is going to be this. So if you have more devoted to the export sector, you're going to have less to consume. That's a negative. But on the flip side, you're going to get more ideas, which is a positive. So you have a trade-off here, right? You have a trade-off. So you don't necessarily have to write this down. Maybe I should have told you that at the beginning. I was just really asking you to be a little creative, right? to think about this a little bit. And, you know, this is actually what a lot of economists do, right? Is they take models that already exist and they say, what's that model missing? How might I change the model and make it a little bit more realistic, or change the model to address a question that I'm interested in, right? And so, you know, there's many ways that you can do this in models. And like I said, a couple of you had some interesting ideas about how you might want to do this. But yeah, you know, that's the beautiful thing about models, is there's kind of an unending variety of ways that you can approach a question and see if you can get some interesting answers that sometimes surprise you. Okay, Question number 6. Look at equation 2.3 in the book. Write this equation in growth rates. This is just the growth rate of the exchange rate, or the percent change in the exchange rate, is equal to the inflation rate in the foreign country minus the inflation rate in the US. And so between 1975 and 2015, if inflation in the US was 4.3% and inflation in Japan was 1.6%, what rate should the dollar have depreciated? At about 2.7%. It should have depreciated at 2.7% a year. What happens if you actually look at the data? So if you calculate the implied growth rate using our implied growth rate formula, Brahm, I think I actually just copied this. I got tired of typing, so I just copied this from you, or copied this equation from you. But if you just see how much the exchange rate changed over the 40 years using our implied growth rate formula, you see it's almost exactly the rate that nominal inflation, that the nominal exchange rate did depreciate. Almost exactly. So yeah, once again, purchasing power parity explains the relationship between inflation and changes in nominal exchange rates very well over the long haul. Not necessarily in the short term, but in the long term. Okay, how about question number 7? So question number 7 says in our open economy macro model, analyze the impact of a decrease in world interest rates. So as we talked about yesterday, a decrease in world interest rates is essentially a reduction in A bar in our open economy, our small open economy macro model. That's wrong. Yeah, no, that's right. Sorry. So yes, a reduction in world interest rates is an increase in domestic interest rates relative to world interest rates. So that's a negative aggregate demand shock. So what do you get? You get a decrease in IS and you get a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay, I won't do the graph up here. You've seen enough of these graphs now to know what a fall in IS and aggregate demand looks like. And of course, short run output is going to fall and inflation is going to fall. All right, how about question number 8? This one we had a little bit more problem with. And I think this was because, I imagine that this is because many of us just did it without necessarily thinking through, right, what was going to happen. So this question said there's a debt crisis in the US leading to a decrease in the demand for US dollars. So using our open economy aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework, what should happen? All right, what should happen? Well, first off, let's think about what happens if there's a decrease in the demand for US dollars. We should see the dollar depreciate. What happens when the dollar depreciates? In our model, this actually increases net exports and is a positive aggregate demand shock. So that alone should increase aggregate demand. But I think, as a few of you noted, that doesn't really make much sense, right? That doesn't make much sense that there's a debt crisis and demand goes up, right? So there's likely other things that are going on. And most likely the other things that are going on is that there's a fall in A bar, right? Because you're having a debt crisis. And so as asset prices fall, wealth is going to go down. As we talked about before when we talked about financial crisis. And we also know that probably the risk premium is going to go up. If there's a financial crisis, we know that there's going to be defaults and people are going to see a lot more financial volatility. These things will reduce aggregate demand. And I think it's reasonable to expect that the fall in aggregate demand is going to way outweigh the increase in aggregate demand. But what I wanted you to do in this question is just to highlight that in some sense, the change in the exchange rate is a stabilizer here. It's going to offset some of the direct consequences of the financial crisis, right? So you have multiple effects here, right? I think experience tells us that these effects, right, the fall in A and the rise in F are the important effects, or the primary effects, but then there's also this secondary effect of the depreciation in the exchange rate, which will help net exports a little bit. And then finally, question number 9, what happens when we include net exports and real exchange rates in our model? And as we talked about in class, this one was really right out of our notes. What happens to the IS curve? The IS curve gets flatter. Why? Because now any change in the real interest rate doesn't just impact investment, it's going to impact net exports through the exchange rate. So what happens here if you change monetary policy? Notice if the central bank reduces interest rates, you're going to get a bigger change in short run output with net exports in it than you would have got in a closed economy. Okay, so this flatter one is the open economy, and this is a closed economy. Okay, so yeah, and I think we talked about just this exact example in class yesterday. So, all right, so who's got questions about homework number 5? Any questions? Hopefully that makes sense. In general, I think there were, little problems here or there. I got the sense that for some of you, that if you missed some problems, sometimes it was just sheer exhaustion. That you maybe didn't spend as much time on this, and I get this. I get that, right? It's a busy time of year, and I mean, you can't. I'm really sick of grading these, so I imagine you're sick of making them. So, okay, well, if there's no questions about homework number 5, let's just, once again, really quickly talk about the exam, and then if you don't have any questions, we're done. So the exam tomorrow, it's going to be worth 125 points. Of that, 60 points is going to be on new material. 65 points is going to be review. Okay, so 60 points on new, 65 points on review. What's going to be included in new material? Chapter 18 on fiscal policy, and chapter 19 and 20 on international trade, open economy macro. Okay, so chapters 18, 19, and 20. In general, I do not think that the material from these 3 chapters is as complicated, as difficult as it has some of the material that we've done that was on the first 2 exams. So I think that you have a good opportunity to do well on the new part of the exam, right? I really do think you have a good opportunity to perform strongly on this, because I think, the material isn't as difficult. And I also think that a lot of this is a little bit more review, right? In the sense that we more kind of closely stuck to some topics that we had talked about in principles, or I know a number of you have taken money in banking from me. A lot of this we kind of covered in money and banking as well. So anyway, I'm hopeful that you can do really well on the new part of the material. Okay, what about the review part? The review part is 65 points. Okay, 65 points. So how did I pick out questions here? I basically picked out 5 questions. And really for me, the important part of this review was I wanted to hit on what I consider to be crucial topics from this class. And I also wanted the questions to be a little bit more open-ended, in which you can connect things that we've talked about throughout the class. Okay? So to put that in other words, I think that the review part is probably a little bit less technical than you might expect, right? In other words, I'm unlikely to ask you to do a lot of detailed calculation kind of questions on the last part, on the review part, and more kind of ask you big picture questions about the things that we've talked about, and to connect some ideas, right? To connect some ideas. So in that sense, once again, I think if you've been grinding along this block, which I think you all have, and been trying to catch up on things that you've missed, or if you struggled with something on the first exam, gone back and looked over it, if you've been keeping up, I think this is an opportunity, I hope, for those of you who might have struggled on a section of the class, a previous section, or might have struggled on one exam or another, to kind of go back and at the end say, yeah, I get it more. I'm putting the pieces together. I've learned how to think like an economist and learned how to think in these models, and can make some connections and really show that I kind of get this at the end, right? And I realize when you're taking a class under the block plan, but particularly a class like this, so much comes at you so fast that sometimes it takes a while for it to sink in. And so I actually think about these questions in many ways as giving many of you another shot to show, yeah, I get this, right? I get this. I get what's going on, okay? So while the exam is longer, it is like I said, 125 points relative to 100 points. I don't think it's really going to take you much longer to actually do the exam, right? Because I think there is, as I said, less technical stuff and less calculation kind of stuff. I don't think it should take you as long. That said, I want to give you the full 3.5 hours for the exam, okay? So we will start at 9 and we'll end at 12:30, and there will be a little leeway after 12:30, right? Because I realize some of you have a hard time. It takes you a while to upload your exam, so I'm not gonna dock you huge points if you're a little bit after 12:30. But at 12:30, you should be preparing to send your exam in. Okay, so that gives you a little bit extra time. I'm hopeful that many of you won't need it, but for those of you who might need it or who have felt the pressure of shortened time on the first 2 exams, this just gives you even a little bit more. Right. But once again, remember, don't write too much on any one question, right? I still think that has been a problem for a few of you, is spending too much on certain questions and like really not leaving yourself enough time to answer other questions. So, in general, try to manage your time. Try not to spend too much time on any one. Don't sit and stew. You can always come back to it, right? And of course, the advice of reading the question and thinking a little bit before you start doing it. That's always good advice as well. So, do any of you have any questions about the exam? All right. Well, I guess that's it then. You know where to find me. So if you have some questions tonight, send me an email. It's kind of weird to be just like saying goodbye to you. I won't see you at the exam tomorrow. But if you're really desperate, yeah, we can get on Zoom and we can look into each other's eyes one more time if you need to. But yeah, I knew Ian, I was looking at you when I said that. So anyway, yeah, if you have questions, send me an email tonight. But if not, we'll just expect the email in your exam or in your inbox tomorrow morning. I'm going to try to get this graded because I don't think anybody wants this hanging over their head over Christmas, right? So I'll get this graded and try to get things back to you in relatively quick order, okay? All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much. Like I said, I've really been impressed with your fortitude this block, and you all grinded it out, and for that you're to be commended. So, okay. All right. Have a good one, everybody. All right. See ya.
Hey, Todd.
Hey, what's up, Cole?
Quick question. So on my number